This video is about the science behind peak performance in sport. And so the big question we're going to talk about is, how does someone become an elite athlete? How does someone go from just a regular old person on the left trying to hit a layup to LeBron James? And really, there are three components: your brain, your genes, and your training. And so your brain is really at the center of it all. It has the most influence on how well you perform. And then your genes and how you train also have about probably an equal influence on your performance. And peak performance is going to occur at the intersection of excellence in all three of these. So being mentally ready, being genetically predisposed, and having done the training necessary to compete at your best. And so, like I said, the brain is really at the center of it all, so that's what we're going to talk about first. So the central governor theory states that our physical performance is regulated by the brain and not limited by our hearts, lungs, or muscles. So this is really important to understand, because a lot of people think that we stop performing well because we have too much lactate building up in our muscles due to a lack of oxygen and anaerobic respiration, but actually our brain is really controlling this more than the physiological components. And next is the psychobiological model, which was developed by Samuel Marcora. And this essentially states that exhaustion occurs not when our body encounters a hard physical limit like running out of glycogen, but rather when the athlete experiences the maximum level of perceived effort that they're willing or able to tolerate. And so in order to understand the psychobiological model, it's really important to understand what perceived effort is. And so the perception of effort is the feeling of activity in the brain that stimulates muscle work. It's not the actual feeling of muscle work itself. So one of the components of perceived effort is attitude. This is really important. If an athlete has a good attitude, they're going to be less bothered by the feeling of working really hard, and they're going to push themselves harder. And this is so important because an athlete's limit of maximum perceived effort tolerance is so impenetrable that they're not even psychologically capable of trying to sustain a maximum intensity exercise longer than 30 seconds. So finally, this is going to bring me to my last point about the brain, which is talking about anticipatory regulation. So one of the big things that determines anticipatory regulation is perceived effort, like we just talked about. And in addition to that, it's also determined by motivation, how much you want to be doing the thing you're doing, knowledge of the distance you have left to cover, and also past experience. And so what all of those inputs determine is your brain's regulation of your body. And that is a continuously refreshed and updated feeling for how to adjust your effort in order to get to the finish line as quickly as possible. So when you're, say, running a race, your brain is always working to make sure your body is doing what it needs to do to get to the end intact and as fast as possible. And so really what all of this means is that your brain is always working to regulate your body, regulate how much effort you're expending to make sure that you make it through whatever activity or competition you're in at that moment. And so this quote does a really good job of explaining what I just tried to explain myself. And it says physical fitness determines where the wall that represents your physical limits is placed. Mental fitness determines how close you're able to get to that limit in competition. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we're going to move on to genetics now. Okay, so here we are with genes. The first gene I'm going to talk about is the ACE gene, and this gene codes for angiotensin converting enzyme, which helps control your blood pressure. So if you have more of the ACE gene expressed, it's going to constrict blood vessels, constraining circulation and increasing your blood pressure. So people who have 2 copies of the insertion variant, so they have a mutation in this gene, are going to have less of the enzyme that the gene codes for, and this can actually lead to increased performance. However, this gene and this variant of the gene is not super prevalent in populations. The next gene is the ACTN3. I'm just going to call it actin-3 gene. And it encodes for the alpha-actinin-3 protein, which is used in fast-twitch muscle fibers. And the normal form of it is the 577R, which allows you to form the protein. And this is really important in sports where you need fast twitch muscles. So maybe in sports where you need to explode really quickly, like sprinting. But there is a form of the gene, the 577X, that doesn't allow you to form the protein. So people who have this protein are going to be able to perform better if they are in a sprinting type environment or sport. Okay, and finally I'm going to talk about VO2 max, which isn't quite a gene, but it's something that's kind of predetermined. It's because of your genetics. So VO2 max is a measurement of how much oxygen an athlete can process during exercise. And the higher the number, the better, because this indicates that an athlete can take in more oxygen and get it to their muscles. And one other kind of determinant of performance is your hemoglobin levels, because hemoglobin is an oxygen carrier in your blood. So VO2 max is something that you can develop and train over time, but our trainability for our VO2 max is about 47% genetically determined. So if you're someone who is born with a high VO2 max, you're going to be predisposed to athletic success. And so there's your baseline and your trainability. And the way you get an elite athlete is someone who has a high baseline. They're born with a really high VO2 max, and they're also able to develop it, and they have a high trainability. But according to research, only between 0.1 and 0.3% of people would have the genetic ability to reach the top of the athletic pyramid. So going back to the question at the beginning, how does someone become an elite athlete? Well, you have to be genetically predisposed to it. And you also have to train smart, and nutrition plays a really big role in this. So, I just want to highlight a couple things about nutrition. I mean, you could read entire books and take classes on this, but beta-alanine is an amino acid found only in animal proteins like fish and white meat, and this is really important in protecting against acid buildup in muscles. And acidic muscles feel more fatigued, so you really want to protect against having those. And then also, one thing that's really interesting is that caffeine can trick our brain into feeling less fatigue so we can perform more effectively, and it's recommended to take in 3 milligrams per kilogram. And then next is your environment. How are you growing up, basically, and how are you competing? So one factor is relative age, so your age compared to the people you're competing with. And actually, if you're relatively younger, you're competing with people who are mostly older than you, it makes you more likely to be elite and end up being really at the top of that athletic pyramid. Also, another saying that I think is really important is talent needs trauma. So you have to go through hardships, you have to learn how to work through that, and this is going to help you become the best. And one other thing that I think is really important for people to know is that research has shown that young athletes shouldn't spend more hours per week than their age in one sport. So there's been a trend of kids specializing really early in one sport to try to become elite, really, but actually if kids are exceeding this, they're more likely, actually 70% more likely, to suffer overuse injuries, which can really hurt them in the long run. And finally, your trainability, which I talked about a little bit in the section about genetics, but this is really how much you can maximize what you're genetically predisposed to. And this is really going to determine how high and how far you can make it. So going back to our question in the beginning, what makes someone an elite athlete? They're gonna be genetically predisposed to it. They're going to be really well conditioned mentally. That's why you see a lot of elite athletes using sports psychologists. And they're also going to be training smart. They're going to have the best coaching, the best trainers, and this is really just a little bit of the science behind it. And there are plenty of great resources out there that you can find to learn more.